Professor Martin Graves was the kind of man who made the word rigid feel like a compliment. In the halls of Hawthorne University, he was legendary, not for brilliance, not for mentorship, but for his unwavering adherence to the book, literally. Everything he taught, every lecture, every discussion, every exam question came directly from the text. Anything outside the margins, any hint of creativity or imagination, was either ignored or punished. His office was a reflection of him, cold, organized, and intimidating. Books stacked perfectly on oak shelves, papers arranged in exact order, a desk polished to a reflective sheen, and a single chair for visitors that squeaked annoyingly whenever someone dared to shift. The smell of old paper and ink clung to the air like armor, a warning, this is not a place for imagination. Students dreaded his office hours. It wasn't just his piercing stare or the way he could reduce you to a stammering mess in seconds. It was the way he dismissed ideas without a word, or worse, with a condescending smile. "You might think that's innovative," he would say, voice slow and deliberate, "but it's incorrect. The book clearly states." And there it was. The finality of absolute authority. No discussion, no debate, just the crushing weight of a rule written decades ago in a textbook he worshipped. He thrived on control. Assignments were graded not for insight, not for understanding, but for adherence. Creativity was considered a risk, or unprofessional, and anyone who dared inject originality into their work became an example. He had favorites, naturally, the students who repeated his words verbatim, who echoed the textbook like a mantra, who never questioned, never challenged, never breathed outside the prescribed formula. Among his students, one person stood apart, Elena Ward. Elena was quiet, unassuming, never drew attention to herself. She sat in the last row of lectures, always polite, always attentive. But unlike her peers, she had a spark. She didn't memorize the textbook blindly. She understood concepts deeply, and she dared to imagine what could happen if the rules were bent, if the ideas were stretched, if the solutions were not just correct but elegant. Professor Graves never noticed her. At least that's what he thought. He didn't call on her, didn't challenge her, didn't mentor her. To him, she was invisible, a ghost in the margins of his orderly kingdom. He continued unaware in his kingdom of precision and fear, believing the book, and only the book, held the power. Creativity was chaos, innovation was rebellion, and he, Professor Graves, was the enforcer of order. But the universe, as it often does, has a sense of irony. Elena, unnoticed, observed. She absorbed. She experimented quietly, taking concepts from the rigid textbook and bending them ever so slightly, tweaking formulas, questioning assumptions, testing the edges of rules in small, careful ways. She didn't seek attention. She didn't defy him openly. She simply learned, adapted, and created in silence. Meanwhile, Professor Graves continued to teach, unchallenged, unquestioned, untouchable in his fortress of rules. But like all fortresses built on fear and rigidity, cracks were beginning to form. Professor Graves didn't just teach the book, he lived it. Lectures were performances of authority. Every sentence carefully recited, every example drawn verbatim from the pages. Questions that hinted at interpretation or alternative approaches were met with sharp pauses and the faintest, cruelest smile. One memorable morning, he strode into the lecture hall carrying a thick, leather-bound textbook. He slammed it on the podium with a decisive thud that made students flinch. "This," he said, voice echoing off the high ceilings, "is not open to debate. If it's in this book, it is correct. If it isn't, it is irrelevant." A brave or foolish student raised her hand. "Professor, could we—" "Sit down," he interrupted coldly. "This is not a discussion. Your interpretations are meaningless unless they mirror the text." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed afraid to move. The student shrank into her seat, cheeks burning. That was the lesson Graves wanted to impart. Obedience over insight, repetition over thought, fear over curiosity. Exams were worse. Grades were not earned through understanding, creativity, or originality. They were earned through exact replication of the textbook. Anyone who tried to innovate or propose a new solution would see their efforts returned in red ink, scribbled with terse comments. Incorrect, not in text. Your imagination does not replace fact. Follow the instructions, not your fantasies. He cultivated fear like a gardener tends roses. Students whispered in hallways, trading stories about who had been publicly shamed last. He would call a student to the front of the class and ask them to explain a concept verbatim. Any hesitation, any deviation, any small error, and he would pause, lean in, and with surgical precision, dissect them in front of their peers. The humiliation wasn't accidental, it was ritualistic. It reminded everyone in the room of their place. Obedience was safety, independence was punishment. Elena sat quietly through it all. She raised her hand sparingly, and when she did, her answers mirrored the text exactly. Outwardly, she was the perfect student. Inwardly, however, her mind worked differently. While Graves lectured, she envisioned possibilities, visualized solutions that were correct but unconventional, and sketched ideas in notebooks he would never see. Even her friends, intimidated by Graves, warned her, "Don't try to be clever, he'll crush you." But Elena's cleverness didn't seek applause. It simmered in silence, growing stronger under pressure, quietly fueled by the very oppression meant to break her. Meanwhile, Graves remained blind. He taught in fear, graded in fear, and demanded fear in return. He didn't notice who was truly learning. He didn't notice who was quietly questioning, observing, imagining. He believed his methods were perfect. His way, the book, was absolute. No one could surpass him, because no one could step outside his rules. He was wrong. And as the semester progressed, Elena was quietly building something the book could never teach. Elena didn't seek recognition. She didn't make a scene. She simply worked in silence, taking the rigid rules of Professor Graves and bending them, not breaking them recklessly, but stretching them to their logical extremes. She experimented with alternative approaches to problems the professor had deemed settled, testing ideas quietly in her notes, in empty classrooms after lectures, and late at night in the library where no one could see her. Her notebooks became a private laboratory. She drew diagrams with additional connections, solved formulas in ways the textbook didn't account for, and created models that were elegant, efficient, and sometimes startlingly insightful. She imagined scenarios the book never even considered, applications in real life, not just theory. Meanwhile, Professor Graves continued his reign of rigid instruction, oblivious to the quiet genius developing under his very nose. He maintained the same routine every day. Lecture, call on obedient students, humiliate anyone daring to be imaginative, and leave the hall convinced that mastery was measured only in memorization. One afternoon, Graves assigned a particularly complex project, a simulation that, according to the textbook, had only one correct solution. The students, terrified, followed his instructions verbatim, working mechanically, repeating steps exactly. Only Elena dared to think differently. She approached the problem from another angle, a method the book explicitly warned against. She tested it meticulously, refining her process until it worked flawlessly. The moment she verified her results, a thrill ran through her. She had just done what no one else had dared. She had succeeded outside the rules. But she didn't run to tell anyone. She knew Graves would dismiss it, humiliate her, or worse. Weeks passed, and the professor remained convinced that the textbook's authority was unassailable. He never noticed the quiet brilliance in his back row. His lectures continued, his red pen remained merciless, his classroom ruled by fear and compliance. Then came the conference, a departmental showcase of student projects. Every student presented their work following the textbook's guidelines. The presentations were neat, correct, but uninspired. Graves sat proudly in the front row, nodding, fully convinced his system had produced perfection. Elena waited for her turn. When she presented, she didn't just follow the textbook. She demonstrated her alternative approach, explaining each step with clarity, showing the outcomes her method produced. Results that were not only correct, but more efficient and elegant than any standard solution. She had broken the rules, yes, but in a way that revealed deeper understanding and real innovation. The room went silent. The professor's jaw tightened. He looked down at his notes, then back at her, unsure whether to scowl or stammer. The students, many of whom had feared him for months, were stunned. She finished, and instead of waiting for approval, she smiled confidently, letting the work speak for itself. For the first time, Professor Graves experienced something he had never encountered. His authority questioned, his rigid methods overshadowed, and a student he never noticed, shining brighter than he could imagine. The seed of reckoning had been planted. Professor Graves was not accustomed to being ignored or outshone. The moment Elena finished her presentation, he stood abruptly, the creaking of his chair loud in the sudden silence. His face, usually a mask of calm superiority, betrayed a flash of panic. That method is entirely unconventional, he said, his voice tight. It doesn't follow the text. It doesn't comply with standard procedure. Elena looked at him steadily. It works, and it's correct. The results are verifiable. A murmur ran through the room. Students whispered, glancing between the professor and the quiet girl in the back row, who had suddenly become the center of attention. Graves' voice rose. The textbook exists for a reason. Creativity is dangerous. Deviations are mistakes. But Elena didn't falter. She calmly explained her reasoning, every step clear, every result backed with logic and evidence. The more she spoke, the more the room leaned in. The more she spoke, the more Graves' authority began to crumble, not because she wanted to dethrone him, but because she had simply done something he could never tolerate. She succeeded without permission. By the end of the demonstration, the department chair, someone Graves deeply respected, intervened. Professor Graves, these results are impressive. Elena has clearly demonstrated understanding and innovation. This is the type of work we encourage in our students. Graves' hands clenched at his sides. His voice dropped to a sharp whisper, directed at Elena. You're breaking the rules. This is not acceptable. You're undermining the curriculum. I'm following the rules of logic and reason, sir, Elena replied calmly. The book teaches method, but it doesn't teach limits to thought. The room went dead silent. Graves' students, who had feared him for months, looked at him differently now. Some saw the cracks in his authority. Others saw that courage could exist outside the margins. After the meeting, whispers followed him down the hall. Did you see Elena's method? She didn't just solve it, she improved it. Even Graves looked uncertain. That uncertainty gnawed at him. For years, he had built his kingdom on fear and precision, believing obedience was the highest form of learning. Now the foundation was shaking. Meanwhile, Elena's quiet brilliance was recognized beyond the classroom. Invitations came to collaborate on research, to present at seminars, to publish her methods. She was no longer invisible. Her mind, once unnoticed, now held attention and respect he could never demand by simply citing the textbook. Graves watched from his office, the walls of his kingdom suddenly feeling smaller. His lectures continued, his grading remained strict, but the aura of untouchable authority had shifted. For the first time, he realized something unsettling. Knowledge alone doesn't command respect. Creativity, courage, and the ability to challenge the rules thoughtfully can eclipse years of rigid control. And Elena, quiet, observant, underestimated Elena, was the living proof. The following semester, Professor Graves attempted to regain control. He doubled down on lectures, reciting passages from the textbook as if the words themselves carried more weight than the students' minds. He called on compliant students more frequently, praising repetition and punishing deviation. Yet the spark had gone out of the room. Fear no longer ruled. Curiosity was rising in quiet, subtle ways. Elena, now recognized as a rising star within the department, continued her work with careful precision and bold creativity. She wasn't flaunting her accomplishments. She had no need, but every paper she submitted, every experiment she conducted carried the unmistakable signature of intelligence untethered by arbitrary limits. Her success was impossible to ignore. Graves began noticing the subtle shifts. Students no longer trembled at his words. They discussed alternative approaches in whispers, then openly. They questioned him politely but firmly. And when he tried to belittle them or cut them down, he found fewer people willing to accept it. One afternoon, he was forced to attend a departmental seminar. Elena presented her latest project, a model that challenged long-held assumptions in the curriculum, supported by data, analysis, and an elegant new method. The seminar room was packed, faculty leaning forward, captivated. Graves sat rigidly in the front row, cheeks flushed, jaw tight. He watched the students nod in understanding, the professors applaud, and the respect that once belonged exclusively to him being given to someone he had overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. After the seminar, the chair approached him privately. "Professor Graves, perhaps it's time to reconsider your approach. Encouraging creativity does not weaken the curriculum, it strengthens it. Look at Elena. She's not just talented, she's inspiring the next generation." Graves left the room in silence. He walked down the hall, past students chatting eagerly, past Elena quietly organizing her notes, past the library where she experimented late into the night. For the first time, he felt the bitter weight of his own rigidity. All those years he had believed that control and fear were the paths to excellence. All those years he had stifled brilliance, including the very student who now surpassed him. He realized, painfully, that intelligence without flexibility is sterile. Authority without respect is hollow. Knowledge without courage to challenge it is meaningless. Elena, unaware of the depth of his internal reckoning, continued her quiet ascent. Invitations to research collaborations, conferences, and publications poured in. She wasn't just succeeding, she was redefining what success meant in a system that had once celebrated memorization over understanding. And as Graves watched her, he felt a mixture of pride, envy, and regret. Pride, because she had grown beyond him. Envy, because she had done what he never could, thriving in freedom rather than confinement. Regret, because he had spent decades crushing minds instead of nurturing them. In the end, the lesson was clear. The rules are not the boundary of thought, they are merely guidelines. Those brave enough to explore beyond them shape the future, and those who cling to them too tightly risk being left behind, watching brilliance flourish where they once demanded obedience. Elena had broken the rules of the book, and in doing so, she had rewritten the story entirely.